You open your eyes in a world where marble dreams crumble into harsh reality. The Ottoman Empire stretches before you, not as the golden paradise of paintings and poems, but as a labyrinth of power where ordinary life teeters between fortune and catastrophe. Here, beneath the towering minarets and behind the guarded palace walls, millions lived their daily existence dancing on the edge of a blade. The morning light filters through gaps in mud walls, illuminating a room that smells of damp wool and the acrid breath of livestock. If fortune has not smiled upon your birth, and statistically it has not, you find yourself among the vast majority who call 4 walls of dried earth and a leaking roof their palace. The family goat, that curious creature who seems to believe it pays rent, methodically devours what remains of your only decent shirt while you contemplate the day ahead. Perhaps you harbor dreams of rising above this station, of donning the pristine uniform of a janissary, those elite soldiers who march in perfect formation through the cobbled streets. Yet even this aspiration carries its own shadow of sorrow. The janissaries were not volunteers who chose glory, but children torn from their families through the Devshirme system, a practice that transformed Christian boys into Muslim warriors through years of rigorous training and absolute loyalty to the Sultan. To become a janissary meant to forget your mother's face, your father's voice, your childhood tongue, replacing these memories with the rhythm of military drums and the weight of imperial duty. The nobility, wrapped in their silk robes and adorned with precious stones, might appear to live in comfort, yet they exist in a world where luxury and danger intertwine like lovers in an eternal dance. A noble's wealth becomes a beacon that attracts not admiration but suspicion, for in the Ottoman Empire to shine too brightly was to invite the Sultan's attention, and his attention could mean elevation to greatness or elimination from existence. The very silk that adorned their bodies could, in a moment of imperial displeasure, become the cord that silenced their breath forever. As consciousness fully embraces the new day, hunger makes its presence known with the persistence of a tax collector. Breakfast in the Ottoman Empire bears no resemblance to the abundant morning meals we might imagine. For the common people, the first meal consists primarily of bread, hard and unyielding as stone, requiring the jaw muscles of a warrior and the patience of a saint. This bread, if one could call it such, often served double duty as both sustenance and building material, so dense and durable that it could withstand the assault of hungry teeth and desperate gnawing. Occasionally, if the gods of fortune smiled upon your household, a small portion of cheese or yogurt might grace your morning table, but these were luxuries reserved for feast days and special occasions, not the daily rhythm of ordinary life. In the great cities like Istanbul, the air itself seemed seasoned with the aromas of better meals, flatbreads emerging golden from clay ovens, sesame seeds scattered like tiny jewels across their surfaces, and the precious olives that glistened in the marketplace stalls like dark emeralds. Yet for those whose purses remained as empty as their stomachs, these tantalizing scents served only as reminders of what lay beyond reach. The marketplace became a theater of cruel irony, where abundance surrounded poverty, where the wealthy could purchase honey-sweetened pastries, while the poor pressed their faces against invisible barriers of economic impossibility. Then there was coffee, that dark elixir that the Ottomans embraced with the passion of converts to a new religion, strong enough to wake the dead, bitter enough to remind you of life's harsh realities. Coffee flowed through Ottoman society like liquid energy, in tiny cups that seemed designed for dollhouse inhabitants. This potent brew carried within it the power to inspire poetry, fuel midnight conversations, and occasionally land its drinkers in prison, when religious authorities declared it a sinful stimulant that corrupted the faithful and encouraged dangerous gatherings of free-thinking citizens. The irony was delicious in its bitter complexity. The empire that would become synonymous with coffee culture periodically banned the very drink that defined its social fabric. Imagine the daily gamble of Ottoman life, where your morning caffeine fix could transform into evidence of heresy, where the simple act of sipping from a ceramic cup could mark you as a rebel against divine law and imperial order. As the last crumbs of impossibly hard bread settle in your stomach like stones in a riverbed, the sound that every Ottoman citizen learned to dread echoes through the narrow streets. The knock at the door carries with it the weight of imperial authority and the promise of financial devastation. The tax collector arrives not as a friend or neighbor, but as an agent of an empire that viewed its subjects primarily as sources of revenue, walking treasuries to be emptied with the regularity of the seasons. Taxes in the Ottoman Empire flowed like tributaries feeding a mighty river, each stream carrying away a portion of what little prosperity ordinary people might accumulate. You paid for the land beneath your feet, the crops that grew from your labor, the animals that provided milk and wool, and if you happened to be Christian or Jewish, you paid the additional privilege tax called jizya, a financial acknowledgement of your non-Muslim status that the empire euphemistically termed protection money. The tax collector approached each household with the demeanor of a man who had seen too many tears and heard too many pleas to be moved by either. Behind him walked a scribe clutching a leather-bound ledger that contained the financial fate of entire neighborhoods, and perhaps a guard whose hand rested casually on his sword hilt, a silent reminder that resistance would be both futile and potentially fatal. The negotiation, if such a polite term could be applied to this one-sided conversation, proceeded with the inevitability of a natural disaster. You offered what you believed you could spare, and the collector informed you that your estimation fell woefully short of imperial expectations. The difference between what you possessed and what the empire demanded was bridged by the systematic confiscation of livestock, household goods, and occasionally the very tools that enabled you to earn the money for next season's taxes. Arguments proved not only useless but dangerous. To question the tax assessment was to question imperial authority, and such questioning could escalate from financial hardship to physical punishment, with the speed of a falcon diving upon its prey. The Ottoman system of collection operated on the principle that resistance indicated hidden wealth, and hidden wealth could be extracted through the application of sufficient pressure, whether economic, social, or physical. City dwellers discovered that their urban existence offered no refuge from this systematic extraction of wealth. Shop owners faced surprise inspections where officials examined scales, questioned pricing, and assessed fines with the creativity of artists and the ruthlessness of conquerors. Too poor to pay immediately meant the confiscation of goods, too slow to comply meant imprisonment, and too proud to cooperate meant the transformation of your livelihood into state property with the stroke of a bureaucratic pen. By the time the tax collectors completed their morning rounds, entire neighborhoods found themselves lighter in possessions and heavier in despair. The mathematical precision of imperial taxation ensured that subjects retained just enough resources to survive until the next collection period, creating a perpetual cycle of barely sustainable existence that fed the empire's endless appetite for revenue. Religion in the Ottoman Empire functioned as both spiritual comfort and financial burden, a dual nature that reflected the complex relationship between faith and imperial policy. The empire proudly proclaimed its Islamic identity, while simultaneously ruling over millions of Christians and Jews, creating a delicate balance between tolerance and taxation that shaped daily life for believers and non-believers alike. For those who did not follow the Islamic faith, each day began with the reminder that spiritual differences carried economic consequences. The jizya tax served as a constant financial acknowledgement of religious minority status, a payment that purchased the right to practice one's faith within the boundaries of imperial law. This arrangement, while allowing for religious diversity, transformed belief itself into a taxable commodity where Christian prayers and Jewish rituals came with a clearly defined price tag. The process of paying religious taxes created its own rituals of humiliation and acceptance. Non-Muslims queued at collection tables where scribes recorded names, calculated payments, and issued receipts that served as proof of continued good standing within the imperial system. The irony was not lost on those who paid that they were purchasing tolerance from an empire that claimed divine mandate for its rule. Some whispered of conversion as a path to financial relief, reasoning that embracing Islam would eliminate the additional tax burden that weighed so heavily on household budgets. Yet this calculation proved overly optimistic, for the empire's hunger for revenue was not satisfied by religious uniformity. Muslim subjects discovered that their faith protected them from the jizya, but not from the multitude of other levies that funded imperial expansion, palace construction, and military campaigns. The religious landscape of the empire created a complex web of privileges and restrictions that extended far beyond taxation. Muslims enjoyed superior legal standing, better access to government positions, and the right to testify in court without their words being automatically discounted. Christians and Jews, despite their protected status as people of the book, found themselves navigating a legal system where their testimony carried less weight, and their opportunities for advancement remained severely limited. Cultural and religious festivals became occasions of both celebration and anxiety, as communities gathered to observe their traditions under the watchful eyes of imperial authorities. A sermon that struck officials as too passionate, a gathering that grew too large, or a celebration that appeared too enthusiastic, could trigger investigations that transformed religious observance into evidence of sedition or rebellion. The empire's approach to religious diversity reflected the pragmatic nature of Ottoman rule, where tolerance served imperial interests by maintaining social stability and ensuring continued tax revenue from diverse populations. Yet this tolerance existed within clearly defined boundaries, and those who ventured beyond these limits discovered that imperial patience had distinct and dangerous limitations. In this environment of qualified religious freedom, faith became a carefully managed aspect of daily life, where believers learned to express their devotion with one eye on heaven and another on the earthly authorities, who determined the practical consequences of their spiritual choices. The Sultan's presence permeated Ottoman society, like incense smoke, invisible yet omnipresent, shaping behavior and triggering anxiety, even when he remained physically distant. Living under absolute monarchy meant that the ruler's emotions, health, and passing whims could cascade through the empire, like ripples from a stone thrown into still water, affecting millions of lives with consequences that ranged from celebration to catastrophe. The morning routine of ordinary citizens included an unconscious calculation of imperial mood, a mental weather forecast that attempted to predict whether the day would bring honors or executions, festivals or wars, generous distributions of wealth or sudden demands for additional taxes. The Sultan's sneeze, quite literally, could trigger empire-wide speculation about succession, foreign policy, and the stability of the realm. Palace gossip filtered through the empire's communication networks like a slow-moving plague, carrying whispers about the ruler's appetite, his conversations with advisors, his treatment of courtiers, and his reactions to various reports from the provinces. Citizens learned to read these signs with the skill of ancient oracles, understanding that their survival often depended on correctly interpreting the emotional climate of a man they would never meet, but whose power over their lives was absolute and immediate. The Ottoman tradition of fratricide, where new sultans eliminated potential rivals by executing their own brothers, created an atmosphere of perpetual uncertainty that extended beyond the palace walls. If the ruler's own family members were not safe from sudden death, what protection could ordinary subjects expect? This brutal pragmatism, designed to prevent civil wars and succession disputes, instead generated a society-wide anxiety disorder where everyone understood that proximity to power increased rather than decreased personal danger. The Sultan's advisors, ministers, and governors lived in a state of constant performance, knowing that their continued existence depended on maintaining imperial favor while avoiding the twin pitfalls of appearing too ambitious or insufficiently loyal. The silk bowstring, that elegant instrument of Ottoman execution, symbolized the empire's ability to eliminate problems with discretion and efficiency, transforming human lives into footnotes in the great ledger of imperial administration. For common citizens, the Sultan's absolute power manifested in the unpredictability of daily life. A decree issued in response to the ruler's indigestion could alter tax rates, change legal procedures, or initiate military campaigns that would consume the lives of thousands. The empire's subjects learned to live in a state of permanent readiness for change, understanding that their personal plans and family futures could be overturned by forces as distant and unpredictable as the weather patterns that shaped the seasons. This system of absolute rule created a society where paranoia became a survival skill, where the ability to anticipate and adapt to imperial caprice was more valuable than wealth, education, or noble birth. The Sultan's power was simultaneously the source of the empire's strength and the seed of its subjects' perpetual insecurity. The thundering approach of military columns announced itself long before the soldiers became visible, as the ground itself seemed to vibrate with the rhythm of thousands of boots marching in unison. The Janissaries, those elite troops who represented both the pinnacle of Ottoman military power and the tragic consequence of the Devshirme system, moved through the empire's cities and towns like a living reminder of imperial strength and the price of that strength paid by families torn apart by state policy. These soldiers, magnificent in their discipline and terrifying in their capabilities, were the product of a system that transformed child taxation into military excellence. Christian boys, selected from villages across the empire based on their physical strength and intellectual potential, were removed from their families to undergo years of intensive training that would reshape them into instruments of imperial will. The irony was profound and heartbreaking in its scope. The empire's most loyal defenders were recruited from among those who had the most reason to resent Ottoman rule. The sight of Janissaries on the march triggered complex emotions in civilian populations. Pride in the empire's military might mixed uneasily with sympathy for the young men who would never again see their birth families or speak their native languages in public. These soldiers, fed the finest food and equipped with the best weapons the empire could provide, were simultaneously privileged and tragic figures, elevated to elite status through a process of systematic cultural erasure. The Janissary Corps represented Ottoman innovation in military organization, creating a professional standing army at a time when most European powers relied on feudal levies and seasonal campaigns. Their barracks became centers of military excellence where young men learned not only the arts of war but also crafts, languages and administrative skills that would serve the empire in various capacities throughout their careers. Yet this military excellence came with its own dangers. The Janissaries' power eventually grew to the point where they could threaten the very sultans they were created to serve. When their pay was delayed or their privileges threatened, these elite soldiers could transform from protectors into revolutionary forces, capable of overthrowing governments and installing new rulers. The empire that had created them as instruments of control discovered that it had forged weapons that could be turned against their makers. The psychological impact of the Janissary system extended far beyond the boys who were recruited. Families lived in constant fear of the selection process, knowing that their strongest and most promising sons could be claimed by imperial agents at any time. Communities developed their own informal networks of protection and concealment, attempting to hide their most valuable young men from the eyes of recruiting officials. The marching Janissaries thus represented the complex nature of Ottoman power, magnificent and terrible, innovative and oppressive, creating loyalty through a process that began with betrayal and building strength through the systematic destruction of family bonds that formed the foundation of traditional society. In a society where every word could be weighed for treasonous content, and every gesture analyzed for signs of disloyalty, the simple act of complaining about daily hardships became an exercise in mortal danger. The Ottoman Empire's approach to free speech was elegantly simple. There was none. Citizens learned to navigate their frustrations through carefully coded language, indirect suggestions, and the kind of silence that spoke volumes about the true state of imperial rule. The marketplace complaint about bread prices, so natural and universal in human society, could transform into evidence of sedition if overheard by the wrong ears or interpreted by suspicious officials as criticism of imperial economic policy. The casual observation that taxes seemed heavier this year might be recorded as questioning the Sultan's financial wisdom, a crime that could escalate from social disapproval to physical punishment with frightening speed. Ottoman society developed its own vocabulary of safe dissent, where complaints were disguised as prayers, criticisms were wrapped in religious references, and political commentary was embedded in seemingly innocent discussions of weather, livestock, or family affairs. Citizens became fluent in the art of saying nothing while meaning everything, of expressing their true thoughts through a complex system of hints, implications, and carefully measured silences. The coffee houses, those centers of social interaction where men gathered to drink, play games, and discuss the affairs of the day, existed in a constant state of tension between their role as community gathering places and their potential as hotbeds of political rebellion. The authorities understood that places where people congregated to consume stimulating beverages and engage in animated conversation were natural breeding grounds for dangerous ideas and coordinated resistance. Spies and informants wove through Ottoman society like threads in a complex tapestry, creating a network of surveillance that made privacy a luxury few could afford. The man serving your coffee might report your words to imperial authorities, the neighbor who borrowed your tools might sell your conversations for a handful of coins, and the friend who shared your table might purchase his own safety by betraying your trust. This atmosphere of constant surveillance created a society where authentic human connection became increasingly difficult, where friendship was tempered by suspicion, and where family gatherings were conducted with the understanding that even blood relatives might choose personal survival over family loyalty. The empire's success in suppressing dissent came at the cost of creating a population that lived in perpetual fear of itself. The result was a culture of performative loyalty, where citizens learned to express enthusiasm for imperial policies they privately despised, to celebrate military victories that had cost them sons and brothers, and to praise the wisdom of rulers whose decisions had brought them to the edge of starvation. This theatrical existence, while ensuring social stability, created a society built on foundations of fear rather than genuine loyalty. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, the weary citizens of the Ottoman Empire might hope for the peace that evening promised. Yet in this realm, where power flowed from the Sultan's palace like water through an intricate system of channels and pools, even rest was subject to the empire's rhythms and demands. The call to evening prayers echoed across cities and towns, a beautiful and haunting sound that reminded all inhabitants of their place within the larger framework of Islamic civilization. Yet this daily ritual, while spiritually meaningful for believers, also served as a reminder of the empire's religious identity and the expectations that came with living under Islamic rule. even for those who did not share the faith. The sound of drums that had punctuated the day with military precision continued into the evening hours, as guard changes, ceremonial duties, and the endless administrative machinery of empire required constant coordination and communication. These rhythmic beats, while stirring and impressive as displays of imperial organization, also made restful sleep difficult for civilians who had already endured long days of labor, taxation, and anxiety. Night brought its own particular fears in Ottoman society, as darkness provided cover for both official and unofficial violence. The silk bowstring preferred by imperial executioners worked just as efficiently in midnight darkness as in palace chambers, and morning often revealed that problems which had existed at sunset had been permanently resolved before dawn. The evening hours also marked the time when tax collectors, debt collectors, and various other agents of imperial authority often chose to conduct their most serious business, understanding that the cover of darkness provided both practical and psychological advantages in dealing with reluctant citizens. The knock on the door after sunset carried implications far more ominous than daytime visits, suggesting that the matter at hand was too sensitive or too severe for public observation. Yet for all its terrors and uncertainties, Ottoman society had its own rhythms of beauty and meaning. Families gathered around humble meals and found ways to create joy within the constraints of imperial rule. Storytellers wove tales that carried both entertainment and coded messages about survival and resistance. Craftsmen created works of beauty that testified to the persistence of human creativity, even under oppressive conditions. The evening hours became a time for the small rebellions of daily life, the whispered joke about imperial officials, the song that carried double meanings, the gathering of friends who trusted each other enough to speak honestly about their hopes and fears. These tiny acts of defiance, while insufficient to challenge the empire's power, provided the psychological sustenance that allowed ordinary people to maintain their humanity within an inhumane system. As night deepened, and the last calls to prayer faded into silence, the empire's subjects settled into sleep with the understanding that surviving another day under Ottoman rule was itself a form of victory. Tomorrow would bring new taxes, new fears, and new reminders of their powerlessness, but tonight they had made it through one more day of imperial existence. The rhythms of sleep in the Ottoman Empire were interrupted not only by official duties and imperial ceremonies, but also by the constant awareness that rest itself was a privilege that could be revoked without notice. The comfortable bed, the secure roof, the quiet household, all of these existed at the pleasure of an imperial system that viewed individual comfort as secondary to state needs. Yet in these precious hours of darkness, when the machinery of empire operated at a reduced pace and the attention of officials was focused elsewhere, Ottoman subjects found space for dreams that transcended their daily reality. In sleep, the peasant could imagine abundance, the merchant could dream of honest profit, and the artisan could envision a world where creativity was valued more than compliance. The morning sun that would rise on another day of Ottoman rule also brought with it the persistent hope that somehow, in ways both small and large, life might become more bearable. This hope, perhaps more than any other force, sustained the millions who lived under the shadow of the crescent moon and the authority of the Sultan's distant but omnipresent power. As we drift away from the Ottoman Empire, where survival was measured in daily victories against an empire that consumed its subjects' dreams along with their resources, let us turn our attention to an aspect of medieval life that was both more humble and more universal than the grand politics of sultans and empires. In the castles and towns of medieval Europe, a different kind of daily struggle was taking place, one that involved the most basic human needs and the ingenious, sometimes desperate ways that people attempted to meet them. The medieval world, with its soaring cathedrals and magnificent castles, its tales of knights and ladies, presents to modern imagination a picture of romance and grandeur that obscures the more mundane, but equally fascinating reality of how ordinary people managed the necessities of existence. Among these necessities, none was more pressing or more revealing of social hierarchies than the simple but essential question of where and how people relieved themselves. In the great stone fortresses that dominated the medieval landscape, the solution to this fundamental human need took the form of the garderobe, an architectural feature that combined practical necessity with defensive innovation in ways that perfectly embodied the medieval ability to merge the sacred and profane, the elegant and crude, within the same structures. The garderobe was far more than a simple toilet. It was a window into medieval attitudes toward privacy, hygiene, and social status. Built into the thick walls of castles, These small chambers projected out over the exterior walls, allowing waste to fall directly into the moat below or onto the ground outside the fortress. This arrangement served multiple purposes. It kept unpleasant odors away from the main living areas. It provided a degree of privacy for noble users, and it occasionally served as an unexpected element of castle defense. The architectural ingenuity of the garderobe reflected medieval practicality at its most creative. The chamber itself was typically narrow and cold, with stone or wooden seating that provided functionality rather than comfort. A shaft cut through the castle wall carried waste directly to the outside, where it fell into water or onto waste piles that were, theoretically, regularly cleaned and removed. The medieval mind found symbolic meaning even in waste disposal. The term garderobe itself came from the practice of hanging clothes in these chambers, based on the belief that the ammonia fumes from human waste would repel moths and other insects that might damage valuable fabrics. This practical application of chemical knowledge, however primitive, demonstrates the medieval tendency to find multiple uses for every available space and resource. Yet the garderobe was also a testament to medieval concepts of privacy and dignity. For the noble classes, having a designated space for bodily functions, however crude by modern standards, represented a significant luxury. The alternative, squatting in fields or using communal facilities, was acceptable for peasants, but beneath the dignity of those who claimed noble blood and aristocratic privilege. The social implications of garderobe access were profound and carefully maintained. The right to use the castle's private toilet facilities was reserved for the nobility and their immediate households, creating yet another marker of social distinction in a society obsessed with hierarchy and status. Servants, soldiers, and visitors of lower social standing were expected to find other arrangements, maintaining the exclusivity of even the most basic amenities. The defensive applications of the garderobe added an element of dark humor to medieval warfare. Besieging armies occasionally found themselves subjected to more than just arrows and boiling oil from castle walls. The contents of garderobes provided defenders with an additional, if unorthodox, weapon against their enemies. The psychological impact of such treatment on attacking forces was not inconsiderable, adding insult to the literal injury of military assault. However, the garderobe also represented a significant vulnerability in castle design. The openings created to allow waste disposal could, under certain circumstances, provide enterprising attackers with alternative routes into the fortress. Historical accounts describe instances where determined besiegers managed to climb through garderobe chutes, entering castles through these most unlikely and unpleasant of doorways. The maintenance of garderobe systems required constant attention from castle servants, who faced the unenviable task of cleaning and maintaining these facilities while dealing with the odors and health hazards that accumulated in their vicinity. The waste that collected below castle walls created breeding grounds for disease and attracted vermin, making the areas around castle garderobes among the most unpleasant and potentially dangerous places in medieval fortifications. Despite these challenges, the garderobe represented a significant advance in medieval sanitary engineering. Compared to the alternatives available to most medieval people, the privacy and convenience of a dedicated toilet facility, however crude, marked a clear distinction between the living conditions of the elite and those of the common population. From the private facilities of the castle elite, we move into the crowded towns and cities of medieval Europe, where the challenges of waste disposal took on entirely different dimensions and created problems that affected entire communities rather than individual households. In the bustling market towns and growing cities of medieval Europe, the solution to human waste disposal took the form of communal privies, large shared facilities that served entire neighborhoods and reflected both the practical necessities and social realities of urban life in an age before modern sanitation systems. These communal toilets were typically constructed as long wooden benches with multiple holes cut in a row, accommodating a dozen or more users simultaneously. Built over large pits or, in more sophisticated examples, overflowing streams that carried waste away from populated areas, these facilities represented attempts to manage the sanitary needs of dense urban populations within the technological and economic constraints of medieval society. The social dynamics of communal privy use reveal fascinating insights into medieval attitudes toward privacy, community, and social interaction. In an age when private space was a luxury reserved for the wealthy elite, the idea of sharing toilet facilities with neighbors was not only acceptable but natural. The communal privy became an unofficial social center, where news was exchanged, gossip was shared, and community bonds were reinforced through the most intimate of shared experiences. The construction and maintenance of these facilities, often fell to religious institutions, particularly monasteries, which had both the organizational capacity and the moral authority to undertake such projects. Monks, with their emphasis on community life and practical service, became pioneers in medieval sanitation, developing some of the most advanced waste management systems of their time. The engineering behind communal privies was more sophisticated than might be initially apparent. The most successful examples were built over flowing water sources that carried waste downstream and away from populated areas. Stone-lined channels directed water flow beneath the seating areas, creating a primitive but effective form of waste removal that prevented the accumulation of material that could lead to disease outbreaks. However, the success of these systems depended heavily on proper maintenance and adequate water flow. When streams ran low during dry seasons, or when channels became blocked with debris, the consequences for public health were severe and immediate. Waste accumulated, odors intensified, and disease spread rapidly through communities that depended on these shared facilities. The social hierarchy of medieval society was reflected even in toilet arrangements. Within communal privies, the most desirable positions, typically those closest to flowing water or furthest from accumulated waste, were often reserved for individuals of higher social status, while those of lower standing made do with less pleasant accommodations. The gender dynamics of communal privy use varied considerably from place to place and time to time. Some facilities were designated for use by men only, others served both sexes simultaneously, and still others operated on informal schedules that separated male and female users. These arrangements reflected broader medieval attitudes toward gender roles and the appropriate boundaries of mixed-sex social interaction. The health consequences of communal privy systems were both positive and negative. On one hand, they concentrated waste disposal in designated areas, preventing the random dumping that could turn entire neighborhoods into disease-breeding grounds. On the other hand, the close proximity of multiple users and the frequent inadequacy of waste removal systems created ideal conditions for the spread of intestinal diseases and parasitic infections. The economic aspects of communal privy maintenance created ongoing challenges for medieval communities. The costs of construction, cleaning, and repair had to be shared among users, leading to complex arrangements involving guilds, religious institutions, and municipal authorities. The most unpleasant aspects of maintenance, the actual removal of accumulated waste, fell to specialized workers who commanded high wages for their willingness to perform tasks that others refused to undertake. Despite their crude nature by modern standards, communal privies represented significant advances in medieval urban planning. They demonstrated recognition that public health was a community responsibility, and that organized approaches to waste management were necessary for the survival and growth of urban populations. Yet, for all the innovations of castle gardobes and communal privies, the vast majority of medieval people lived in rural areas where such facilities were unknown luxuries, and where the management of human waste followed patterns that had remained essentially unchanged since ancient times. Beyond the stone walls of castles and the wooden benches of urban privies lay the world of the medieval countryside, where the vast majority of Europe's population lived and worked. Here, in villages and farms scattered across the landscape, the question of waste disposal was answered not through architectural innovation or community planning, but through humanity's oldest and most direct relationship with the natural environment. For the medieval peasant, the toilet was wherever nature provided suitable opportunity. Fields lying fallow between planting seasons, the edges of forests where privacy could be found among the trees, the banks of streams that would carry waste downstream. These natural spaces served as the bathroom facilities for millions of people who lived their entire lives without ever seeing a garderobe or communal privy. This intimate relationship with the landscape shaped not only daily routines, but also agricultural practices. Human waste, mixed with animal manure and composted plant matter, provided essential fertilizer for crops that fed both the people who produced it and the noble classes who claimed ownership of the land itself. The cycle of consumption, disposal, and renewed growth connected medieval peasants to their environment in ways that were both practical and profoundly symbolic. The social dimensions of rural waste disposal reflected the communal nature of peasant life. Privacy, as understood by modern sensibilities, was largely unknown. Families, neighbors, and even strangers might share the same outdoor spaces for their most intimate bodily functions, creating bonds of familiarity and mutual understanding that transcended the embarrassment that such arrangements might cause in other social contexts. Seasonal variations created different challenges and opportunities for rural waste management. Winter brought problems of frozen ground and harsh weather that made outdoor excursions uncomfortable and potentially dangerous. Summer heat intensified odors and attracted insects that could make certain areas temporarily unusable. Spring floods might wash away accumulated waste but could also contaminate water sources and agricultural areas. The nomadic nature of rural toilet practices created its own health hazards. Without designated waste areas, contamination of water sources was a constant threat. Wells, streams, and rivers used for drinking, washing, and cooking could easily become polluted by human waste, leading to outbreaks of dysentery, cholera, and other waterborne diseases that swept through rural communities with devastating regularity. Gender differences in rural waste disposal reflected broader medieval attitudes toward women's roles and social position. Women responsible for household management and childcare often had to coordinate their personal needs with their domestic duties, finding time and privacy for toilet functions while maintaining supervision of children and oversight of household activities. The integration of human waste into agricultural systems required practical knowledge that was passed down through generations of farming families. Peasants learned when and where to deposit waste for maximum fertilizer benefit, how to compost human and animal manure together, and which areas to avoid during certain seasons to prevent crop contamination. Children growing up in rural medieval environments learned waste disposal practices as naturally as they learned to walk and talk. Boys and girls were taught the informal rules that governed community sanitation, where to go, when to avoid certain areas, how to minimize contamination of water sources, and the seasonal rhythms that determined the safest and most practical toilet locations. The medieval church's influence on rural sanitation practices reflected the complex relationship between spiritual and physical cleanliness. Religious teachings emphasized moral purity while acknowledging the practical necessities of bodily functions, creating a framework of beliefs that governed not only spiritual behavior but also the most intimate aspects of daily life. Despite the apparent crudeness of rural waste disposal methods, they represented sustainable approaches to sanitation that worked within the technological and economic constraints of medieval society. The integration of human waste into natural cycles of decomposition and renewal demonstrated an understanding of ecological relationships that, while lacking scientific precision, achieved practical results that sustained rural populations for centuries. While peasants found their toilet facilities in the fields and forests of the countryside, and nobles enjoyed the relative luxury of castle garderobes, the religious communities of medieval Europe developed their own distinctive approaches to sanitation that reflected their unique combination of communal living, spiritual discipline, and practical engineering. Within the walls of medieval monasteries, abbeys, and religious houses, the challenge of waste disposal was addressed through a combination of spiritual discipline, communal responsibility, and innovative engineering that produced some of the most advanced sanitary systems in medieval Europe. The monastic approach to toilets reflected their broader understanding that physical cleanliness and spiritual purity were intimately connected aspects of the religious life. The monastic redorter, as these communal latrines were formerly known, represented a significant advancement over the sanitary facilities available to most medieval people. Built as long stone chambers with multiple seats arranged in rows, these facilities were typically connected to flowing water systems that carried waste away from living areas with an efficiency that would not be matched in secular contexts for centuries. The engineering sophistication of monastic sanitation systems reflected the intellectual resources and organizational capabilities of religious communities. Monks and nuns, many of whom were drawn from educated backgrounds and had access to ancient texts on engineering and medicine, applied their learning to the practical challenges of maintaining healthy living conditions for large communal populations. Water management was central to monastic sanitation success. Religious communities diverted streams, constructed channels, and built elaborate systems of pipes and conduits that brought fresh water into their buildings, while simultaneously carrying wastewater away. These systems required constant maintenance and repair, tasks that became part of the regular duties assigned to monastery residents. The spiritual dimensions of monastic toilet practices added layers of meaning to activities that were purely functional in secular contexts. Rules governing the use of latrines emphasized silence, modesty, and contemplation, transforming even bodily functions into opportunities for spiritual reflection and discipline. The act of maintaining clean facilities became a form of service to God and community. The social organization of monastic communities was reflected in their toilet arrangements. While all members of the community used the same facilities, subtle hierarchies determined seating arrangements, timing of use, and responsibility for maintenance. Abbots and abbesses might have slightly more private arrangements, but the emphasis on communal equality meant that even religious leaders shared the basic sanitary facilities with their subordinates. The daily routines of monastic life were carefully coordinated to accommodate the communal use of sanitary facilities. Regular schedules governed when different groups within the monastery could use the latrines, preventing overcrowding while ensuring that all community members had adequate access. These schedules were integrated with the broader rhythm of religious observances, meals, and work assignments that structured monastic existence. The health benefits of monastic sanitation systems were reflected in the generally superior life expectancy and disease resistance of religious communities compared to secular populations. The combination of clean water, effective waste removal, and disciplined personal hygiene practices created living conditions that supported larger populations in closer quarters than would have been sustainable using the sanitary methods available outside monastery walls. The influence of monastic sanitation innovations extended beyond religious communities through several channels. Monasteries served as hospitals and guest houses for travelers, exposing secular visitors to superior sanitary standards. Religious communities also provided technical advice and labor for municipal projects, spreading their engineering knowledge to urban centers seeking to improve their own waste management systems. The economic aspects of monastic sanitation required careful management of resources and labor. The construction and maintenance of advanced water and waste systems consumed significant portions of monastery budgets and required specialized skills that were developed and transmitted within religious communities. The investment in sanitary infrastructure reflected monastic priorities that balanced spiritual goals with practical necessities. The documentation preserved in monastic records provides detailed insights into medieval sanitation practices that are unavailable from other sources. Rules, regulations, maintenance schedules, and financial accounts relating to toilet facilities offer historians unprecedented glimpses into the daily realities of medieval waste management and the social attitudes that shaped sanitary practices. From the engineered solutions of monastic communities, we turn to examine the unsung heroes of medieval sanitation, the men whose willingness to work in the most unpleasant conditions made urban life possible, and whose dangerous labor kept medieval cities from drowning in their own waste. In the darkness of medieval nights, when honest citizens secured their doors and shuttered their windows against the dangers that lurked in narrow streets and shadowed alleyways, another kind of worker emerged to perform tasks that were essential to urban survival, but too disgusting and dangerous for daylight hours. These were the gong farmers, also known as nightmen, whose profession involved the removal of human waste from the cesspits and privies that served medieval towns and cities. The term gong farmer derived not from any agricultural association, but from the Anglo-Saxon word gong, meaning filth or dung. These men earned their living by descending into waste-filled pits with primitive tools, shovels, buckets and ropes, to extract the accumulated refuse of urban populations. The work was performed at night both to minimize public offense and to take advantage of cooler temperatures that made the stench slightly more bearable. The physical demands of gong farming exceeded those of almost any other medieval profession. Workers had to climb down into pits that could be 10 feet deep or more, wade through liquid waste that reached their waists or chests, and shovel solid matter into buckets that were hauled to the surface by rope. The work required not only physical strength, but also the mental fortitude to function in conditions that would incapacitate most people within minutes. The health hazards faced by gong farmers were extreme, and often fatal. The pits generated toxic gases, methane, hydrogen sulfide, and ammonia, that could cause unconsciousness, respiratory failure, and death within minutes. Historical records describe gong farmers collapsing at the bottom of cesspits, overcome by fumes, with their bodies only recovered when other workers noticed their absence. The risk of drowning in liquid waste was constant, and any slip or fall could prove fatal. Despite the extreme dangers and social stigma associated with their profession, gong farmers were essential to urban survival. Without their services, medieval cities would have been overwhelmed by waste within months, creating public health disasters that would have made urban life impossible. The economic importance of their work was reflected in their wages, which were typically higher than those paid to common laborers, though the premium was hardly sufficient compensation for the risks and degradation involved. The social position of gong farmers reflected medieval society's complex relationship with necessary but unpleasant work. While their services were essential, the workers themselves were often treated as pariahs, forced to live on the outskirts of towns and required to wear distinctive clothing that identified their profession to passers-by. This social ostracism extended to their families, creating hereditary castes of waste workers who had little opportunity for social mobility. The working conditions of gong farmers varied considerably depending on the wealth and organization of the communities they served. In larger, more prosperous towns, gong farmers might work in teams with better equipment and more systematic approaches to waste removal. In smaller, poorer communities, individual workers might labor alone with minimal tools and no safety precautions beyond their own experience and intuition. The disposal of waste removed from urban pits created additional challenges that gong farmers had to address. The extracted material had to be transported beyond city walls, typically in covered carts that were pulled through empty streets in the pre-dawn hours. Some waste was buried in designated areas, while portions that were less contaminated might be sold as fertilizer to farmers willing to purchase human manure for their fields. The seasonal variations in gong farming work reflected the broader rhythms of medieval urban life. Summer heat intensified odors and accelerated decomposition, making the work more unpleasant but also more urgent. Winter cold could freeze waste solid, making extraction more difficult but reducing the production of toxic gases that posed the greatest immediate threat to worker safety. The tools and techniques used by gong farmers evolved slowly over time, passed down from master to apprentice within families that specialized in the trade. Innovations in bucket design, rope management, and pit ventilation could mean the difference between completing a job successfully and suffering injury or death. This practical knowledge, while never recorded in formal texts, represented a sophisticated understanding of waste management challenges. The legal status of gong farmers reflected their essential but marginal position in medieval society. Laws typically required their services while simultaneously restricting their movements and activities. Regulations might specify when and where they could work, what routes they could use for waste transport, and even where they were permitted to live within urban areas. While gong farmers labored in darkness to remove waste from urban areas, the disposal methods used in medieval cities created their own set of challenges that affected every resident and shaped the daily experience of urban life in ways that were both practical and profoundly unpleasant. The streets of medieval cities served multiple functions that would seem incompatible to modern sensibilities. They were thoroughfares for commerce and transportation, gathering places for social interaction and public ceremonies, and unfortunately, they were also the primary disposal sites for much of the waste generated by urban populations. This convergence of activities created living conditions that tested human adaptability and resilience to their absolute limits. The practice of emptying chamber pots directly into the street was so common that it developed its own social protocols and warning systems. The cry of "Gardez l'eau," watch out for the water, in France, or similar warnings in other languages, became part of the auditory landscape of medieval cities, alerting pedestrians to duck for cover as waste was hurled from upper-story windows. This system, while providing a form of social courtesy, did nothing to address the fundamental problem of waste accumulation in public spaces. The composition of street waste included not only human excrement, but also kitchen scraps, animal carcasses, industrial refuse, and the droppings of horses, oxen, pigs, and other animals that shared urban spaces with human residents. This mixture created a constantly changing landscape of filth that pedestrians had to navigate with skill developed through necessity and experience. The economic implications of street waste disposal created both problems and opportunities for medieval urban communities. The accumulation of organic matter provided food for pigs and other scavenging animals, but it also attracted rats, flies, and other vermin that spread disease. Some cities attempted to manage the problem by licensing scavengers to collect valuable waste materials, creating primitive recycling industries based on the recovery of useful items from urban refuse. The health consequences of street waste disposal were severe and far-reaching. Contaminated water sources, disease-carrying insects, and airborne pathogens created ideal conditions for epidemic outbreaks that could devastate urban populations within weeks. The Black Death and other plague outbreaks that swept through medieval Europe found fertile ground in cities where waste disposal practices had created perfect breeding environments for disease vectors. The social hierarchies of medieval society were reflected in the distribution of waste disposal problems. Wealthy neighborhoods might have better drainage, more frequent cleaning, and superior access to alternative waste management options, while poorer areas accumulated filth that created health hazards for entire districts. The ability to avoid the worst effects of inadequate sanitation became another marker of social distinction. The seasonal rhythms of medieval urban life were heavily influenced by waste disposal challenges. Spring rains might wash accumulated filth into rivers and streams, providing temporary relief, but also contaminating water sources downstream. Summer heat intensified odors and accelerated decomposition, making certain areas of cities temporarily uninhabitable. Winter cold could freeze waste in place, creating different but equally unpleasant challenges for urban residents. The attempts by medieval authorities to regulate street waste disposal reflected growing awareness of the connections between sanitation and public health. Even though the scientific understanding of disease transmission remained primitive, laws prohibiting the dumping of certain materials, requiring property owners to maintain clean frontages, and establishing fines for improper waste disposal represented early efforts at municipal sanitation management. The technological limitations of medieval waste management meant that even well-intentioned regulations were difficult to enforce, and often ineffective in practice. Without adequate infrastructure for waste collection and disposal, citizens had few alternatives to street dumping, making compliance with sanitation laws nearly impossible for most urban residents. The cultural adaptations that allowed medieval people to function in these unsanitary conditions demonstrated remarkable human resilience and creativity. People developed strategies for navigating waste-filled streets, learned to recognize and avoid the most contaminated areas, and created social networks that shared information about sanitation hazards and temporary solutions. The legacy of medieval street waste disposal practices influenced urban planning and public health policies for centuries. The recognition that cities required organized approaches to waste management laid the groundwork for the sanitation innovations that would eventually make modern urban life possible and healthy. As the medieval period progressed and populations grew, some communities began to develop more sophisticated approaches to waste management that would eventually evolve into the sanitation systems that support modern urban civilization. The gradual recognition that human waste disposal required organized community responses rather than individual solutions marked a crucial transition in medieval urban development. Cities that managed to implement effective sanitation measures not only improved the quality of life for their residents, but also gained competitive advantages in trade, population growth, and economic development that shaped the emergence of the modern European city. The evolution of medieval attitudes toward waste disposal reflected broader changes in social organization, technological capability, and understanding of the relationships between environment and health. Communities that had previously accepted filth as an inevitable aspect of urban life began to experiment with collective solutions that required unprecedented levels of cooperation and resource allocation. The engineering innovations that emerged from medieval sanitation challenges demonstrated the creative potential that arose from pressing practical needs. Water management systems, waste collection methods, and disposal technologies developed during this period laid the foundations for the sanitary infrastructure that would eventually support much larger urban populations in healthier conditions. The social and economic consequences of improved sanitation created feedback loops that accelerated urban development and population growth. Cities with better waste management attracted more residents, generated more commerce, and accumulated the resources necessary for further infrastructure improvements, while communities that failed to address sanitation challenges often stagnated or declined. The medieval struggle with waste disposal thus represents more than simply a colorful footnote to history. It illustrates the fundamental challenges that all human societies must address in order to create sustainable living conditions for dense populations. The solutions developed during this period, however crude by modern standards, demonstrated the ingenuity and determination that would eventually produce the sanitary systems that make contemporary urban life possible. As we move away from the medieval world of castles and waste pits, let us journey even further back in time to an era when humanity was discovering some of its most enduring innovations, not in the realm of sanitation, but in the arts of sustenance and celebration that would shape human culture for millennia to come. The Bronze Age emerges from the mists of prehistory, not merely as a time of technological advancement in metalworking, but as an era when human communities were discovering the transformative power of fermentation and the social bonds that could be forged through the sharing of intoxicating beverages. Long before the medieval struggles with sanitation, before the Ottoman Empire's complex bureaucracies, ancient peoples were learning to harness the invisible forces that could transform simple grains and honey into drinks that altered consciousness and strengthened community ties. The archaeological evidence for Bronze Age brewing comes not from written records, which barely existed in most regions during this period, but from the chemical analysis of pottery vessels that once held these ancient beverages. Residue analysis has revealed the telltale signatures of barley starches, honey sugars, and other organic compounds that prove our ancestors were experimenting with fermentation thousands of years before the first written recipes were recorded. The discovery of brewing was likely accidental, as many of humanity's most important innovations have been. Grain stored in pottery vessels, exposed to wild yeasts and moisture, would have begun fermenting naturally, producing alcoholic beverages that early people quickly learned to appreciate, not only for their intoxicating effects, but also for their nutritional value and keeping properties. In an age when clean water was often difficult to obtain, mildly alcoholic beverages provided safer alternatives that could be stored for extended periods without spoilage. The social implications of Bronze Age brewing extended far beyond simple sustenance or intoxication. The production of alcoholic beverages required surplus grain, which meant that only communities with successful agricultural systems could afford to transform food into drink. The ability to brew beer or mead thus became a marker of prosperity and successful resource management, a way for communities to demonstrate their abundance to neighbors and visitors. The process of brewing also required specialized knowledge and skills that were likely passed down within families or communities through generations of experimentation and refinement. Master brewers would have held important positions within Bronze Age societies, their expertise in fermentation making them valuable members of communities that increasingly depended on stored food and drink for survival through seasonal variations and periodic shortages. The ingredients available to Bronze Age brewers varied considerably depending on geography and season, leading to the development of regional brewing traditions that reflected local resources and preferences. Barley formed the backbone of most early beers, but wheat, honey, fruits, and various herbs and spices were incorporated to create beverages that were unique to particular communities and occasions. Honey, when available, was particularly prized as a brewing ingredient because it fermented readily into mead, a drink that carried special significance in many Bronze Age cultures. The sweetness of honey made mead more palatable than grain-based beers, while its relative rarity gave it associations with luxury, celebration, and divine favor that would persist in European cultures for thousands of years. The fermentation process itself seemed magical to Bronze Age peoples, who watched simple ingredients transform over days or weeks into substances that could alter consciousness and preserve nutrients. This transformation was often attributed to supernatural forces, leading to the association of brewing with religious rituals and the belief that fermented beverages could facilitate communication with gods and ancestors. The vessels used for brewing and serving these ancient beverages reveal sophisticated understanding of the fermentation process and the social importance of drinking rituals. Large ceramic jars for fermentation, smaller serving vessels for individual portions, and elaborate ceremonial cups for special occasions demonstrate that Bronze Age peoples had developed complex material cultures around the production and consumption of alcoholic beverages. The communal nature of Bronze Age brewing and drinking created social bonds that strengthened community cohesion and provided mechanisms for resolving conflicts, celebrating achievements, and marking important transitions in individual and community life. The act of sharing fermented beverages became a fundamental aspect of Bronze Age social organization, creating obligations and relationships that extended beyond immediate family groups. The production of alcoholic beverages in the Bronze Age was intimately connected with the development of feasting traditions that served multiple social, political, and religious functions within ancient communities. The Bronze Age feast represented far more than simply a meal shared among community members. It was a complex social institution that combined the consumption of food and drink with displays of wealth, demonstrations of political power, religious observances, and the reinforcement of social hierarchies that structured ancient societies. Archaeological evidence from across Europe and the Near East reveals the remains of massive feasting sites where hundreds of people gathered to consume enormous quantities of meat and alcoholic beverages in celebrations that could last for days. The political dimensions of Bronze Age feasting were sophisticated and far-reaching. Chieftains and emerging elites used feasts as opportunities to display their wealth and generosity, demonstrating their ability to provide abundance for their followers while creating obligations and loyalties that supported their political authority. The host of a feast gained prestige and political capital through the conspicuous consumption of resources, while guests acknowledged their dependent status by accepting hospitality and participating in rituals that reinforced existing power structures. The scale of Bronze Age feasting was impressive by any standard. Archaeological excavations have uncovered sites with enormous cooking pits, massive quantities of animal bones, showing evidence of simultaneous slaughter and consumption, and pottery sherds from hundreds of drinking vessels used in single celebrations. These findings suggest that some feasts involved the participation of entire regional populations, bringing together communities from wide geographical areas for celebrations that strengthened political alliances and cultural identity. The preparation for major feasts required extensive planning and resource accumulation that demonstrated the organizational capabilities of Bronze Age societies. The coordination of food production, beverage brewing, site preparation, and guest management demanded sophisticated logistical skills and social cooperation that helped develop the administrative capacities that would later support more complex political organizations. The ritual aspects of Bronze Age feasting were closely integrated with religious beliefs and practices that governed relationships between humans, ancestors, and divine forces. Offerings of food and drink to gods and spirits were essential components of feasting ceremonies, with portions of the finest foods and most potent beverages being ceremonially destroyed or buried to honor supernatural powers and ensure their continued favor. The seasonal timing of major feasts reflected the agricultural cycles that governed Bronze Age life, with celebrations often coinciding with planting, harvest, or other significant points in the farming year. These seasonal feasts served not only as religious observances, but also as opportunities for communities to share resources, exchange information, and coordinate activities across extended periods when individual households might be isolated by distance and weather. The social hierarchies that structured Bronze Age societies were both displayed and reinforced through feasting practices that allocated food, drink, and seating according to status and rank. The most honored guests received the choicest portions of meat and the strongest alcoholic beverages, while their physical positioning at the feast, proximity to the host, elevation above other participants, access to special serving vessels, communicated their social standing to all attendees. The gender dynamics of Bronze Age feasting varied among different cultures and regions, but generally reflected broader patterns of male dominance in public political activities. While women certainly participated in feast preparation and consumption, the roles of host, honored guest, and ritual officiant were typically reserved for men, reinforcing gender hierarchies that extended beyond the feast itself into all aspects of Bronze Age social organization. The economic implications of feasting extended far beyond the immediate costs of food and drink, influencing patterns of production, trade, and resource allocation that shaped Bronze Age economies. Communities that wished to host impressive feasts needed to accumulate surplus agricultural production, acquire exotic goods through trade networks, and develop craft specializations that produced the vessels, tools, and decorative objects that enhanced the prestige of feasting events. The archaeological record of Bronze Age feasting provides insights into ancient dietary practices, cooking technologies, and food preservation methods that would otherwise be lost to history. The analysis of animal bones from feast sites reveals which species were considered most valuable for ceremonial consumption, while chemical analysis of pottery residues provides evidence for the ingredients and preparation methods used in ancient cooking and brewing. The ingredients and techniques used in Bronze Age brewing reveal sophisticated understanding of fermentation processes and demonstrate the creativity and experimentation that characterized ancient approaches to beverage production. The master brewers of the Bronze Age worked without the benefit of scientific understanding of fermentation, yet through generations of experimentation and careful observation, they developed techniques that produced consistently successful results and created beverages that satisfied both nutritional needs and social expectations. Their methods, reconstructed through archaeological evidence and ethnographic parallels, reveal a sophisticated understanding of the practical aspects of fermentation that enabled them to control and manipulate natural processes to achieve desired outcomes. Barley served as the foundation ingredient for most Bronze Age brewing, chosen not only for its ready availability and successful cultivation across diverse climatic conditions, but also for its superior fermentation characteristics and nutritional content. The malting process, which converted grain starches into fermentable sugars, was accomplished through controlled sprouting that activated natural enzymes while preventing the grain from developing into mature plants. This technique required precise timing and careful management of moisture and temperature conditions that demanded considerable skill and experience. The mashing process that followed malting involved crushing the sprouted grain and mixing it with hot water to extract the sugars needed for fermentation. Bronze Age brewers accomplished this without the benefit of metal vessels, large enough for major brewing operations, instead using heated stones dropped into ceramic or wooden containers to achieve the temperatures necessary for sugar extraction. This technique required careful coordination and presented significant challenges in temperature control and timing. Wild yeasts provided the fermentation agents that transformed sugary grain extracts into alcoholic beverages. But Bronze Age brewers had to work with naturally occurring microorganisms, whose behavior was unpredictable, and whose effects varied considerably depending on environmental conditions, seasonal factors, and the specific strains present in different geographical locations. Successful brewing required understanding of how to encourage beneficial yeasts while preventing the growth of organisms that would spoil the finished product. Honey, when available, was incorporated into Bronze Age brewing, both as a primary fermentation ingredient for mead production and as a flavoring and strengthening agent for grain-based beverages. The natural sugars in honey fermented readily, but the production of successful honey-based beverages required different techniques than those used for grain brewing, including careful management of acidity levels and fermentation temperatures that prevented the development of unpalatable flavors. Herbal additives played important roles in Bronze Age brewing, serving multiple functions that included flavoring, preservation, and the enhancement of intoxicating effects. Herbs like juniper, yarrow, and various local plants were added to fermenting beverages to create distinctive regional specialties and to provide medicinal benefits that ancient peoples associated with particular plants. Some of these herbal additives had mild psychoactive properties that complemented the effects of alcohol and contributed to the ritual significance of the finished beverages. Fruit-based fermentation represented another avenue of Bronze Age experimentation, with grapes, apples, berries, and other seasonal fruits providing the raw materials for wines and flavored beverages that took advantage of natural sugar content and seasonal availability. These fruit-based drinks were often associated with specific times of year and particular celebrations that coincided with harvest periods and the availability of fresh ingredients. The fermentation vessels used in Bronze Age brewing were typically large ceramic jars that could hold substantial quantities of liquid, while allowing for the expansion and gas production that accompanied the fermentation process. These vessels were often partially buried in the ground to provide temperature stability, and were covered with materials that allowed gases to escape while preventing contamination from insects and airborne organisms. The duration of Bronze Age fermentation varied considerably depending on the ingredients used, environmental conditions, and the desired strength and flavor of the finished product. Some beverages were consumed while still actively fermenting, providing a fizzy, mildly alcoholic drink with significant nutritional content, while others were allowed to ferment completely and then aged for extended periods to develop more complex flavors and higher alcohol content. Quality control in Bronze Age brewing relied on sensory evaluation and empirical knowledge passed down through generations of practitioners. Brewers learned to recognize the visual, aromatic, and taste indicators that distinguished successful fermentation from contaminated or spoiled batches, developing expertise that allowed them to adjust techniques and ingredients to achieve consistent results, despite the variability of their raw materials and equipment. The storage and serving of Bronze Age alcoholic beverages required additional technologies and techniques that preserved the quality of finished products and enhanced their social significance. Storage vessels, serving containers, and drinking implements were often decorated with symbolic motifs and crafted with artistic skill that reflected the ceremonial importance of the beverages they contained. The architectural and material culture evidence for Bronze Age feasting reveals the sophisticated social and ceremonial contexts within which ancient beverages were consumed and the central role that alcohol played in community life. The great halls and ceremonial spaces where Bronze Age feasting took place were among the most impressive architectural achievements of their time, designed not merely to shelter large gatherings but to create dramatic settings that enhanced the social and ritual significance of communal drinking and dining. These structures, reconstructed from archaeological remains found across Europe and the Near East, reveal sophisticated understanding of how physical spaces could be manipulated to support complex social interactions and reinforce cultural values. The central hearth dominated most Bronze Age feasting halls, serving not only as a source of warmth and cooking facility, but also as a focal point around which social hierarchies were arranged and ceremonial activities were organized. The positioning of participants around the hearth communicated their status within the community, with the most honored individuals seated closest to the fire and the host, while others were arranged in patterns that reflected their relative importance and social relationships. The acoustic properties of Bronze Age feasting halls were carefully considered to support the storytelling, music, and ritual speech that accompanied communal drinking. The timber construction and interior arrangements created spaces where voices could be projected effectively to large audiences, enabling the oral traditions that preserved community history religious beliefs, and cultural values to be shared during feasting ceremonies. The serving and consumption of alcoholic beverages in Bronze Age feasting contexts involved elaborate material culture that demonstrated both practical ingenuity and artistic sophistication. Large ceramic vessels for communal drinking were often decorated with intricate designs that carried symbolic meaning, while individual drinking cups and bowls reflected regional artistic traditions and personal status through their size, decoration, and materials of construction. The use of straws for communal drinking from large vessels represents one of the most distinctive aspects of Bronze Age drinking culture, enabling multiple participants to share beverages from the same container while maintaining social protocols about precedence and status. These straws, made from reeds or hollow plant stems, were often decorated or modified to indicate the status of their users and to enhance the ceremonial aspects of communal consumption. The integration of Bronze Age feasting spaces with other community facilities reveals the central importance of these activities in ancient social organization. Many feasting halls were located adjacent to craft production areas, storage facilities, and religious sites, creating architectural complexes that supported the full range of activities associated with major community celebrations and political gatherings. The seasonal use patterns of Bronze Age feasting facilities reflect the agricultural cycles that governed ancient communities and the resource requirements of major celebrations. Archaeological evidence suggests that some feasting sites were used primarily during specific times of year, particularly harvest seasons, when agricultural surpluses were available to support large-scale consumption, and when community members had the time and energy to participate in extended celebrations. The maintenance and preparation of Bronze Age feasting spaces required significant community investment in terms of both labor and resources. The construction and repair of large halls, the accumulation and storage of vessels and equipment, and the coordination of activities necessary for major feasts represented substantial commitments that could only be sustained by prosperous and well-organized communities. The artifact assemblages associated with Bronze Age feasting sites provide detailed insights into the scale and complexity of ancient celebrations. Quantities of animal bones, pottery sherds, and other refuse indicate that some feasts involved the consumption of dozens of cattle, hundreds of smaller animals, and thousands of liters of alcoholic beverages, representing investments of resources that were significant even for prosperous Bronze Age communities. The symbolic and ritual objects found in Bronze Age feasting contexts reveal the religious and ceremonial dimensions of these gatherings that extended far beyond simple social drinking and dining. Ceremonial weapons, religious artifacts, and decorated vessels demonstrate that feasts were occasions for the performance of rituals that connected participants with ancestors, gods, and the supernatural forces that Bronze Age peoples believed governed their world. The evidence for deliberate destruction and burial of feasting equipment suggests that some Bronze Age celebrations concluded with ritual acts that permanently removed valuable objects from circulation, demonstrating the willingness of ancient communities to sacrifice substantial wealth in service of religious and social obligations that maintained cosmic and social order. The legacy of Bronze Age brewing and feasting traditions extends far beyond their immediate historical context, establishing patterns of social drinking and communal celebration that continue to influence human culture thousands of years after their origins. The innovations in fermentation technology and social organization that emerged during the Bronze Age laid the foundations for brewing traditions that would spread throughout Europe and beyond, ultimately giving rise to the beer, wine, and mead production that became central to medieval and modern European culture. The techniques developed by ancient brewers provided the basic methods that would be refined and elaborated by subsequent generations, creating continuities of practice that connect contemporary brewing with its prehistoric origins. The social functions of Bronze Age feasting established precedents for the use of alcohol in political, religious, and community contexts that would be adopted and adapted by later civilizations. The Roman symposium, the medieval banquet, and modern state dinners all reflect organizational principles and social protocols that can be traced back to Bronze Age innovations in using shared consumption of food and drink to create and maintain political relationships. The religious and ritual dimensions of Bronze Age drinking traditions influenced the development of later ceremonial practices that incorporated alcohol into sacred contexts. The Christian Eucharist, with its symbolic consumption of wine representing divine blood, echoes ancient beliefs about the sacred nature of fermented beverages and their power to facilitate communication between human and supernatural realms. The technological innovations of Bronze Age brewing contributed to the development of agricultural and food processing techniques that supported larger populations and more complex societies. The understanding of fermentation processes, the development of storage technologies, and the creation of specialized vessels and equipment provided foundations for later advances in food preservation and production that enabled the growth of urban civilizations. The archaeological methods used to study Bronze Age brewing and feasting have contributed to the development of scientific techniques for analyzing ancient organic remains and reconstructing prehistoric lifeways. Chemical analysis of pottery residues, microscopic examination of plant remains, and isotopic studies of animal bones have provided insights into ancient diets and social practices that would have been impossible to obtain through traditional archaeological approaches. The cross-cultural similarities in Bronze Age feasting practices reveal fundamental aspects of human social organization that transcend specific cultural contexts. The use of shared consumption to create social bonds, the employment of hospitality as a political tool, and the integration of drinking with religious observance appear to be universal human behaviors that emerged independently in diverse geographical and cultural settings. The economic implications of Bronze Age brewing and feasting contributed to the development of surplus production, craft specialization, and trade networks that supported increasingly complex social organizations. The demand for brewing ingredients, serving vessels, and ceremonial objects created markets that encouraged technological innovation and cultural exchange across vast geographical distances. The environmental impact of Bronze Age brewing and feasting practices influenced landscape management and resource utilization strategies that shaped ancient relationships between human communities and their natural surroundings. The need for large quantities of grain, fuel, and water for brewing and cooking required sustainable management practices that balanced immediate consumption needs with long-term resource conservation. The artistic and decorative traditions associated with Bronze Age drinking culture contributed to the development of symbolic systems and aesthetic practices that enriched ancient material culture and provided models for later artistic traditions. The decorated pottery, metalwork, and other objects associated with feasting demonstrate sophisticated understanding of how material culture could be used to communicate social meanings and cultural values. The study of Bronze Age brewing and feasting continues to provide insights into fundamental questions about human social evolution, the origins of complex societies, and the role of shared consumption in creating and maintaining social bonds. These ancient practices illuminate aspects of human nature and social organization that remain relevant to understanding contemporary culture and addressing modern challenges in community building and social cooperation. From the communal halls where Bronze Age peoples shared their first fermented beverages, we turn our attention to another group of ancient peoples whose relationship with the sea would prove equally transformative for the development of human civilization. The Illyrians emerge from the shadows of ancient history as master mariners, whose dominion over the Adriatic Sea would shape the naval traditions of the Mediterranean world for centuries to come. Along the rugged eastern shores of the Adriatic, where jagged mountains meet the restless sea, these ancient peoples developed a maritime culture that balanced the arts of commerce and warfare, with a skill that both impressed and terrified their neighbors. The geography that shaped Illyrian civilization was harsh and unforgiving, a landscape of limestone peaks, deep river valleys, and countless islands that offered refuge to those who knew how to navigate their treacherous waters. This terrain, unsuitable for the large-scale agriculture that supported other ancient civilizations, drove the Illyrians toward the sea and shaped them into a people whose very identity was inseparable from their mastery of wind and wave. The Adriatic itself served as both highway and barrier, its choppy waters and unpredictable weather patterns creating challenges that only the most skilled mariners could overcome. Yet, for those who mastered its moods, the sea offered pathways to wealth and power that transcended the limitations of their rocky homeland. The Illyrians learned to read the sea's signals as farmers read the sky, developing an intimate knowledge of currents, winds, and seasonal patterns that would serve them well in both peaceful trade and predatory warfare. From the earliest historical records, the Illyrians appear as a people caught between two worlds: the civilized Mediterranean cultures that valued order and predictability, and the wild freedom of the sea that recognized no law but strength and cunning. This duality would define their relationships with neighbors and ultimately determine their fate as independent peoples. The development of Illyrian maritime culture reflected a practical adaptation to environmental constraints that transformed necessity into opportunity. Unable to support large populations through agriculture alone, Illyrian communities turned to the sea for sustenance, wealth, and power, developing technologies and social organizations that maximized their advantages while compensating for their limitations in land-based resources. The seasonal rhythms of Illyrian life were governed by the patterns of Mediterranean weather and the opportunities they created for maritime activities. Summer brought calm seas ideal for trading expeditions and the transport of goods between distant ports, while winter storms provided cover for raids against enemy shipping and coastal settlements. This annual cycle of commerce and conflict shaped Illyrian society in ways that distinguished them from land-based peoples who lived according to agricultural calendars. The social organization of Illyrian communities reflected their maritime orientation, with status and leadership often determined by success at sea rather than control of land or agricultural wealth. Ship captains and successful raiders could accumulate wealth and followers that elevated them to positions of political authority, creating fluid social hierarchies that rewarded ability and daring over birth or traditional privilege. The technological innovations that emerged from Illyrian maritime culture would eventually spread throughout the Mediterranean world, influencing naval architecture and tactics that would be adopted by much larger and more powerful civilizations. The ship designs that enabled Illyrian success at sea represented solutions to specific challenges of Adriatic navigation that proved equally valuable in other maritime contexts. The cultural values that developed within Illyrian society emphasized flexibility, adaptability, and the ability to shift between different roles as circumstances demanded. The same individuals who served as peaceful merchants in one season might become fearsome raiders in the next, reflecting a pragmatic approach to survival that recognized few absolute distinctions between legitimate commerce and predatory warfare. The religious and spiritual beliefs of the Illyrians were deeply influenced by their maritime environment, incorporating worship of sea deities, weather gods, and supernatural forces that were believed to control the winds and waves upon which their survival depended. These beliefs provided both practical guidance for navigation and ritual frameworks for managing the uncertainties and dangers of life at sea. The evolution of Illyrian society from a collection of scattered coastal communities into a formidable maritime power was closely connected with their development of the dual economy that combined legitimate trade with predatory raiding in ways that maximized their economic opportunities, while creating constant tension with their neighbors. The Illyrian approach to maritime economics reflected a sophisticated understanding of the opportunities and limitations created by their geographic position at the crossroads of Mediterranean trade routes. Positioned between the Greek colonies of the south and the Italic peoples of the west, with access to the inland resources of the Balkan Peninsula, the Illyrians found themselves ideally situated to serve as intermediaries in commercial networks that spanned the ancient world. As merchants, the Illyrians proved indispensable to the functioning of Adriatic trade networks, carrying goods that ranged from the exotic to the essential between markets that might otherwise have remained isolated from each other. The metals extracted from Balkan mines, the amber that traveled ancient trade routes from the Baltic Sea, the livestock and agricultural products of inland valleys, and the manufactured goods of Greek and Italic workshops, all passed through Illyrian hands at various points in their journeys to final consumers. The commercial reputation of Illyrian traders was built on their intimate knowledge of Adriatic waters, and their ability to navigate passages that other mariners considered too dangerous to attempt. This specialized knowledge gave them competitive advantages in trade negotiations and enabled them to maintain profitable monopolies over certain routes and commodities that required their unique skills and local expertise to transport safely. Yet the same geographic advantages and maritime skills that made the Illyrians valuable trading partners also enabled them to engage in piracy and raiding with effectiveness that terrified their neighbors and disrupted Mediterranean commerce. The countless islands and hidden coves of the Dalmatian coast provided perfect bases for raiders who could strike without warning and disappear before their victims could organize effective responses. The transition between commerce and piracy was often seamless, reflecting practical considerations rather than moral distinctions that might have constrained the behavior of other peoples. An Illyrian captain might engage in peaceful trade during one voyage and turn to raiding during the next, depending on opportunities, weather conditions, and the relative risks and rewards of different activities. The organization of Illyrian raiding reflected sophisticated understanding of naval tactics and strategic planning that went far beyond simple opportunistic piracy. Coordinated attacks involving multiple vessels, carefully planned assaults on specific targets, and systematic disruption of enemy trade routes demonstrated military capabilities that rivaled those of established naval powers. The economic benefits of successful raiding extended beyond the immediate value of captured goods, to include the political advantages gained by leaders who could distribute wealth among their followers, and the strategic benefits of disrupting the commerce of potential enemies. Raiding thus served multiple functions within Illyrian society, providing both material rewards and political tools that supported the authority of successful chiefs and captains. The international reputation of the Illyrians as both traders and pirates created complex diplomatic situations that required careful navigation by other Mediterranean powers. Greek city-states and Italian communities found themselves simultaneously dependent on Illyrian commercial services and threatened by Illyrian predatory activities, leading to relationships characterized by chronic instability and mutual suspicion. The responses of other Mediterranean peoples to Illyrian piracy varied considerably depending on their own naval capabilities and political priorities. Some attempted to negotiate protection agreements that essentially involved paying tribute to Illyrian leaders in exchange for safe passage, while others organized naval patrols and punitive expeditions designed to suppress raiding activities through force. The long-term consequences of Illyrian maritime activities extended far beyond their immediate economic and political effects, to influence the development of naval technologies, legal frameworks, and diplomatic practices that would shape Mediterranean civilization for centuries. The challenges posed by Illyrian piracy forced other powers to develop more effective naval capabilities and more sophisticated approaches to maritime security. The cultural legacy of Illyrian maritime traditions can be seen in the persistence of certain social values and organizational patterns that emphasized individual initiative, flexible leadership structures, and the integration of commercial and military activities. These characteristics would continue to influence the peoples of the Eastern Adriatic long after the disappearance of independent Illyrian political entities. The technological masterpiece that enabled Illyrian maritime dominance was the Liburna, a vessel whose innovative design would ultimately be adopted by the Roman navy and spread throughout the Mediterranean as one of the most successful warship designs of the ancient world. The Liburna represented the culmination of centuries of Illyrian experimentation with ship design, incorporating solutions to the specific challenges of Adriatic navigation, while optimizing performance characteristics that would prove valuable in a wide range of maritime contexts. Named after the Liburnian tribe of northern Illyria, this vessel embodied the practical wisdom and technological sophistication that distinguished Illyrian maritime culture. The design principles that governed Liburna construction reflected deep understanding of the relationship between ship architecture and tactical performance. The vessel's long, narrow hull provided the speed and maneuverability that were essential for the hit-and-run tactics preferred by Illyrian raiders, while its shallow draft enabled operation in coastal waters where larger ships could not safely navigate. The propulsion system of the Liburna combined the flexibility of sail power for long-distance travel with the tactical advantages of oar, propulsion for combat and precise maneuvering. The arrangement of rowing positions, typically organized in two banks, provided sufficient power for high-speed operations while maintaining the vessel's sleek profile and minimizing the crew requirements that made larger warships expensive to operate. The construction techniques used in Liburna building reflected both the limitations of Illyrian resources and the ingenuity of their shipwrights. Built primarily from local timber, using traditional Mediterranean shipbuilding methods, these vessels achieved remarkable performance through careful attention to proportions and structural details, rather than through expensive materials or complex engineering solutions. The tactical applications of the Liburna revolutionized naval warfare in the Adriatic and influenced military thinking throughout the Mediterranean world. The vessel's speed enabled raiders to overtake merchant ships that might otherwise escape, while its maneuverability allowed for complex tactical formations and evasive actions that frustrated the attacks of heavier opponents. The versatility of the Liburna design made it equally valuable for commerce and warfare, enabling Illyrian captains to shift between different roles as opportunities arose. The same vessel that carried trade goods to distant markets could be quickly converted for raiding operations by embarking additional warriors and weapons, reflecting the flexible approach to maritime activities that characterized Illyrian culture. The crew requirements of the Liburna were carefully balanced to provide maximum effectiveness while minimizing operational costs. The relatively small crew needed to operate these vessels made them economical for independent captains and small communities, while their effectiveness in combat made them attractive to leaders seeking to build naval power without massive investments in shipbuilding and maintenance. The defensive capabilities of the Liburna were optimized for the vessel's primary tactical role as a fast attack craft, while not heavily armored or designed to withstand prolonged combat against larger opponents. The Liburna's speed and agility provided protection through avoidance and the ability to choose when and where to engage enemy forces. The influence of Liburna design on Mediterranean shipbuilding extended far beyond the Illyrian homeland, as other naval powers recognized the advantages of this innovative vessel type. Greek naval architects studied captured Liburnae to understand their design principles, while Roman engineers would eventually adopt and refine the design for their own naval operations. The construction and operation of Liburnae required specialized knowledge and skills that were passed down through generations of Illyrian shipwrights and mariners. This technical expertise became one of the most valuable resources of Illyrian communities, providing them with competitive advantages that could not be easily replicated by their neighbors. The evolution of Liburna design continued throughout the period of Illyrian independence as shipbuilders responded to changing tactical requirements and incorporated innovations that improved performance or reduced costs. These ongoing refinements reflected the dynamic nature of Illyrian maritime technology and the continuous feedback between practical experience and design innovation. The legacy of the Liburna in Mediterranean naval architecture demonstrates the ways in which technological innovations developed by smaller cultures could influence the practices of much larger civilizations. The adoption of Illyrian ship design by the Roman Navy represents one of the most successful examples of ancient technology transfer and cultural diffusion. The height of Illyrian maritime power coincided with the reign of Queen Tuta, whose aggressive policies toward neighboring peoples would ultimately provoke the Roman intervention that ended Illyrian independence, but ensured their place in Mediterranean history. Queen Tuta emerged as the most prominent figure in Illyrian history during the early 3rd century BCE, when she assumed regency over the Ardeae, one of the most powerful Illyrian tribes, following the death of her husband King Agron. Her reign coincided with a period of maximum Illyrian expansion and confidence, when their naval supremacy in the Adriatic seemed unshakable and their raiding activities had reached unprecedented levels of organization and effectiveness. The political context of Tuta's rise to power reflected the complex tribal structures that characterized Illyrian society, where leadership was often fluid and dependent on personal charisma, military success, and the ability to maintain the loyalty of warriors and ship captains. As a female ruler in a warrior culture, Tuta faced unique challenges in establishing her authority, but her apparent success in maintaining control over Illyrian forces demonstrates her considerable political and military capabilities. The expansion of Illyrian piracy under Tuta's leadership represented both the culmination of traditional raiding practices and a qualitative escalation that transformed sporadic predatory activities into something approaching systematic maritime warfare. The scale and coordination of attacks launched during her reign suggested sophisticated planning and organization that went far beyond the opportunistic raiding that had characterized earlier periods. The diplomatic crisis that developed between Illyria and Rome during Tuta's reign arose from the intersection of expanding Roman commercial interests with traditional Illyrian raiding practices. As Roman trade networks expanded into the Adriatic, Italian merchants increasingly fell victim to Illyrian pirates, creating pressure on the Roman Senate to take action to protect Roman citizens and commercial interests. The famous confrontation between Tuta and Roman ambassadors, as recorded by ancient historians, illustrates the cultural misunderstandings and conflicting legal traditions that made peaceful resolution of the crisis virtually impossible. Tuta's reported claim that piracy was a traditional Illyrian custom that should be respected by foreigners reflected genuine differences in how Mediterranean peoples understood maritime law and legitimate economic activity. The Roman decision to launch military intervention against Illyria in 229 BCE represented a significant escalation in Roman foreign policy and marked the beginning of sustained Roman involvement in the eastern Mediterranean. The First Illyrian War demonstrated Roman naval capabilities and revealed the Senate's willingness to use force to protect Roman commercial interests and maintain what they considered appropriate international order. The military campaigns that followed Roman intervention revealed both the strengths and limitations of Illyrian maritime power when confronted by the systematic application of superior resources and organization. While Illyrian forces initially offered effective resistance, their ultimate inability to match Roman logistics and persistence demonstrated the limits of what could be achieved through naval supremacy alone. The terms imposed on Tuta following her defeat reflected Roman determination to eliminate the threat of Illyrian piracy while establishing Roman influence in the eastern Adriatic. The restrictions placed on Illyrian naval activities, the territorial concessions demanded by Rome, and the tribute requirements imposed on Illyrian communities effectively ended their independence and reduced them to Roman client status. The personal fate of Queen Tuta, following her submission to Rome, remains somewhat unclear in historical sources, but her political eclipse marked the end of independent Illyrian resistance to Roman expansion. Her brief but dramatic career demonstrates both the possibilities and limitations faced by ancient peoples who attempted to maintain their independence in the face of Roman imperial expansion. The historical significance of Tuta's reign extends beyond its immediate political and military consequences to illuminate broader themes in ancient Mediterranean history, including the conflicts between traditional cultures and expanding empires, the role of women in ancient warfare and politics, and the complex relationships between piracy, commerce, and state formation in the ancient world. The legacy of Tuta's resistance to Roman authority contributed to later traditions of Illyrian independence and provided inspiration for subsequent resistance movements in the Balkans. Her example demonstrates the ways in which individual leaders could embody cultural values and national aspirations that transcended their immediate political contexts. The Roman perspective on Tuta and Illyrian piracy, as preserved in ancient sources, reflects the complex process by which expanding empires justified intervention in the affairs of neighboring peoples, while constructing narratives that portrayed imperial expansion as necessary responses to external threats rather than aggressive conquests. The Roman conquest of Illyria marked the end of independent Illyrian political power, but it also began a process of cultural and technological exchange that would see Illyrian innovations adopted throughout the Roman Empire and ultimately spread across the ancient world. The Roman approach to conquered peoples typically involved a complex mixture of suppression and absorption that sought to eliminate political threats while exploiting useful technologies and cultural practices. In the case of the Illyrians, Roman pragmatism led to the adoption of Illyrian ship designs and naval techniques that would prove crucial to Roman maritime supremacy in the Mediterranean. The integration of the Liburna into Roman naval forces represented one of the most successful examples of ancient technology transfer, demonstrating how military innovations developed by smaller cultures could be scaled up and systematized by larger imperial powers. Roman shipbuilders and naval architects studied captured Illyrian vessels and adapted their design principles to meet the specific needs of Roman naval strategy. The Roman version of the Liburna incorporated modifications that reflected Roman organizational preferences and tactical doctrines, while maintaining the essential performance characteristics that had made the original design so effective. Roman Liburna were typically built to more standardized specifications, equipped with uniform weapons and equipment, and operated by crews trained according to Roman military protocols. The deployment of Roman Liburnae throughout the Mediterranean demonstrated the versatility and effectiveness of the original Illyrian design in diverse maritime environments. These vessels served effectively in Atlantic waters off the coasts of Spain and France, in the rough seas of the English Channel, and in the calmer waters of the eastern Mediterranean, proving that Illyrian innovations had applications far beyond their original Adriatic context. The tactical applications of Roman Liburnae evolved to meet the changing needs of imperial naval strategy, with these vessels serving roles that ranged from fleet reconnaissance and communication to coastal patrol and anti-piracy operations. The flexibility of the basic design enabled Roman naval commanders to adapt Liburnae for specialized missions, while maintaining their essential advantages in speed and maneuverability. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE provided the most famous demonstration of Liburna effectiveness in Roman service, when Octavian's fleet, which included large numbers of Liburna, defeated the combined forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. The superior speed and maneuverability of the smaller Roman vessels enabled them to outflank and harass the larger ships of their opponents, contributing significantly to Octavian's victory and his eventual establishment of the Roman Empire. The administrative and logistical advantages of Liburnae made them particularly valuable for the routine operations that maintained Roman control over the Mediterranean. Their relatively low cost, simple maintenance requirements, and small crew needs enabled the Romans to maintain large numbers of these vessels in service, providing the persistent naval presence that discouraged piracy and maintained the security of maritime trade routes. The influence of Illyrian naval traditions on Roman maritime culture extended beyond ship design to include tactical doctrines, navigation techniques, and organizational practices that had been developed through centuries of Adriatic seafaring. Roman naval manuals and training procedures incorporated knowledge that ultimately derived from Illyrian maritime expertise, though it was filtered through Roman military traditions and adapted to imperial needs. The spread of Laberna-based designs throughout the Roman Empire contributed to the development of regional naval traditions that combined Roman organizational principles with local maritime expertise. Provincial fleets operating in diverse environments from the Rhine to the Nile included vessels that traced their ancestry to Illyrian innovations, demonstrating the enduring value of these ancient design solutions. The economic impact of Roman adoption of Illyrian naval technology created new opportunities for shipbuilders, mariners, and naval suppliers throughout the empire. The standardization of Laberna construction and the establishment of systematic maintenance and replacement programs generated substantial economic activity and contributed to the development of maritime industries in numerous Roman provinces. The cultural legacy of Illyrian maritime traditions persisted even after the disappearance of independent Illyrian political entities, influencing the development of seafaring cultures throughout the eastern Mediterranean and contributing to the naval traditions that would eventually be inherited by Byzantine and later maritime powers. The historical significance of Roman adoption of Illyrian innovations demonstrates the complex processes of cultural transmission and technological diffusion that characterized ancient Mediterranean civilization, showing how military conquest could paradoxically lead to the preservation and spread of conquered peoples' most valuable contributions to human knowledge and capability. As we conclude our journey through these ancient worlds of Ottoman bureaucracy, medieval sanitation, Bronze Age celebration, and Illyrian seafaring, we are reminded that human history is woven from countless threads of innovation, adaptation, and survival that connect us across millennia to our ancestors, who faced challenges both similar to and utterly different from our own. The Ottoman Empire, with its complex hierarchies and systematic oppression, demonstrates how political systems can create elaborate mechanisms for extracting wealth and compliance from subject populations while maintaining the illusion of order and divine sanction. The daily struggles of Ottoman subjects, from the hardships of taxation to the dangers of speaking freely, remind us that survival under authoritarian rule requires constant vigilance and adaptation. The medieval approaches to sanitation reveal humanity's persistent struggle to balance individual needs with community health, showing how social hierarchies influence even the most basic aspects of human existence, from the private gardobes of castle nobles to the communal privies of townspeople and the open fields that served rural populations. We see how access to basic facilities reflected and reinforced broader patterns of social inequality. The Bronze Age innovations in brewing and feasting illuminate the deep connections between technological advancement and social organization, demonstrating how the mastery of fermentation processes enabled ancient peoples to create new forms of community bonding and political authority. The transformation of simple grains and honey into intoxicating beverages paralleled the transformation of scattered agricultural communities into more complex social hierarchies. The Illyrian maritime culture exemplifies the ways in which environmental constraints can drive technological innovation and cultural adaptation, showing how a people constrained by harsh geography could develop specialized skills that enabled them to project power far beyond their homeland. Their legacy in naval architecture demonstrates how innovations developed by smaller cultures can ultimately influence much larger civilizations. These diverse historical episodes share common themes that illuminate fundamental aspects of human nature and social organization: the struggle for survival, the quest for power and status, the need for community and meaning, and the drive for innovation and adaptation appear in different forms across cultures and centuries, suggesting that certain challenges and responses represent constants in human experience. The technological innovations examined in our journey, from Ottoman administrative systems to medieval waste management, from Bronze Age fermentation to Illyrian ship design, demonstrate humanity's remarkable capacity for creative problem-solving and adaptation to diverse environmental and social challenges. These innovations often emerged from practical necessities rather than abstract planning, showing how human ingenuity typically responds to immediate pressures rather than following predetermined development paths. The social and political dynamics explored in these historical contexts reveal both the persistence of human hierarchies and the various ways that different cultures have organized power relationships. Whether examining Ottoman Sultanate, medieval feudalism, Bronze Age chieftainships, or Illyrian tribal structures, we see recurring patterns of authority and resistance that transcend specific cultural contexts. The religious and cultural dimensions of these ancient worlds demonstrate the central importance of belief systems and symbolic practices in human societies. From Ottoman Islamic law to medieval Christian concepts of cleanliness, from Bronze Age ritual feasting to Illyrian maritime spirituality, we see how supernatural beliefs provide frameworks for understanding and organizing practical aspects of daily life. The economic systems that sustain these diverse civilizations reveal the complex relationships between environmental resources, technological capabilities, and social organization that determine what kinds of societies can develop and persist in particular contexts. The taxation systems of the Ottoman Empire, the waste management economics of medieval towns, the surplus production that enabled Bronze Age feasting, and the commercial networks that supported Illyrian piracy all demonstrate how material constraints shape cultural possibilities. The human cost of these historical systems, the suffering of Ottoman subjects, the disease burden of medieval sanitation failures, the social tensions generated by Bronze Age inequality, and the violence of Illyrian maritime predation, reminds us that technological and social innovations often come at significant prices that are borne disproportionately by those with the least power to resist or escape their circumstances. Yet these same historical episodes also reveal human resilience, creativity, and the capacity for finding meaning in community, even under the most challenging conditions. The survival strategies developed by Ottoman peasants, the social bonds created in medieval communal privies, the ritual significance of Bronze Age feasting, and the maritime skills of Illyrian sailors all demonstrate positive aspects of human adaptation and cultural creativity. The lessons from these ancient worlds remain relevant to contemporary challenges as we face our own struggles with political authority, public health, social inequality, and environmental constraints. The historical perspective provided by examining diverse approaches to common human problems can inform our understanding of current issues and suggest alternative possibilities for addressing persistent challenges. As we drift away from these ancient echoes, carried by the currents of time back toward our own present moment, we carry with us the voices of countless individuals who lived, struggled, and adapted in worlds that seem simultaneously foreign and familiar. Their experiences remind us that human history is not simply a sequence of events, but a continuous process of creative response to the fundamental challenges of existence that connect us across the centuries to all who have come before and all who will follow after. The fire burns low now, and shadows lengthen across the walls as these ancient stories fade back into the silence from which they emerged. Yet their echoes linger in the darkness, whispering of empires that rose and fell, of innovations that changed the world, and of ordinary people who lived extraordinary lives in times both distant and eternal. Rest now, and let these voices of the past carry you gently into dreams where history and imagination dance together in the endless theater of human memory.